the HRL coal-fired power station proceeding. We need to fight the site battles. We need to protect the Great Barrier Reef. We need to make sure that we're not digging up new coals for export, new export lines. And there's a community in Poolong this morning, several hundred people, possibly up to 1,000 people in a small community of about 400 people, who are making a human sign at the moment, saying no coal or CSG for their community. So we need to do that. We need to fight those tough local site battles. But we also need to campaign for systemic changes. These corporations, in some cases, and I don't want to tar them all with the same brush, but you know, the Gina Rineharts and the ex-Gratas and the Exxon Mobils of the world care about one thing. They care about money. And we need to hit them where it hurts. We need to go for their money, particularly the public money that they're getting. It's one thing for them to pour their own wealth into these new projects. It's another for them to pour the common wealth into these projects that threaten our future. So, if there's one thing these companies care about, it's the revenue streams, and fossil fuel subsidies are a critical revenue stream and critical to the ongoing profitability of many of their projects. Fossil fuel subsidies are a big deal. This graph shows global fossil fuel subsidies around $500 billion every year. Last year, I don't have it on the graph, but in 2011 it was revealed a few weeks ago that they rose by 30% globally. So we're now at $523 billion governments globally are putting into fossil fuel subsidies. The International Energy Agency, a very conservative body, concluded that fossil fuel subsidies are public enemy number one when it comes to climate change and clean energy. They estimated that $523 billion is equivalent to an incentive to emit carbon of $110 per tonne. So it's the same story that's happening in Australia, around the world. We're putting way more money into fossil fuel subsidies and encouraging the extraction of fossil fuels than we are into climate change mitigation. It's not just Environment Victoria that's identified this as a problem. We're really excited to be working on this campaign because its time has come. We've got international organisations that wield some serious clout telling our federal government to remove fossil fuel subsidies. We've got the OECD, International Energy Agency, the World Bank, the United Nations, and recently the G20 nations have made a commitment to remove fossil fuel subsidies. We have, of course, worked on fossil fuel subsidies in the past in Australia. Critical to the success of the campaign to stop the HRL coal-fired power station was the pressure that we exerted, people in this room and others, on the federal government to withdraw their $100 million polluting grant to the HRL coal-fired power station. And we forced Martin Ferguson to withdraw that $100 million grant, which was the death knell for that project. Other groups in Australia have done some really good work on fossil fuel subsidies in the past. We've seen strong work in the lead up to federal budgets from groups like ACF and Greenpeace, who have done some really good analysis, the Australia Institute and others. And there's been some good media and lobbying work in Canberra. But in the battle of lobbyists, we're not going to win. We really need to crank up our campaigns and need to take our campaign on fossil fuel subsidies to the streets and suburbs of Australia. Not just in the lead up to the budget, that's a really critical time, but also beyond, through the federal election, through to next year when Australia chairs the G20 nations. So that will be very interesting when we're chairing the G20, which has an official position to remove all fossil fuel subsidies. So our campaign, this is Wayne's phone. He's got a headache. Actually, he's got a few. His major headache at the moment is trying to come up with a balanced budget or a budget surplus, or at least a small deficit of the next federal budget, and of course the mining tax has been a complete flop. And we've got some good news for Wayne. We just found $50 billion over the forward estimates. In fact, we found $35 billion in just 4 fossil fuel subsidies. I'll just quickly work through these 4 fossil fuel subsidies. Every year for the next 5 years, we're giving the most polluting power stations in Australia $1 billion a year. Last March, we were going to deliver the closure of our dirtiest power stations if we're paying them to stay open. And of course, many of us worked for the commitment to close Hazelwood Power Station. We got the government to commit to a process called contracts to closure, where they started negotiating with power stations about paying them to close. And guess what? The negotiations failed. The power stations wanted too much money. They thought that they were valued, their value was too high, and the federal government didn't want to pay that much. And we're going to be releasing, as part of one of our first steps of this campaign, releasing some really important research this week. Hopefully you will be reading about it on the front pages of the paper and seeing the evening news. That work's been supported by some very generous donors of Environment Victoria's. But we have looked at the operation of the carbon price for the first 6 months. We've looked at the profitability of the brown coal power stations. We've looked at what they're selling electricity for on the spot markets for every half-an-hour interval since July the 1st, when the carbon price was introduced, through December 31st. And we've got a very credible energy analyst to do this work, by the way. And what we've found is the electricity generators, the Victorian brown coal generators, have passed on more than 100% of the carbon price since it was introduced to retailers and therefore onto consumers. And therefore, their profitability has not been at all impacted by the carbon price. So the question remains, and the question that we're discussing with the Prime Minister's office and the Climate Change Minister's office at the moment, as they try and convince us not to release the report, the question is why we're giving them $5 billion in compensation because the carbon price was going to affect their profitability when it clearly hasn't. The largest of the fossil fuel subsidies is the fuel tax credit program, which was about $4.5 billion about 3 years ago. It's forecast to be about $6 billion this year. The reason it's increasing so dramatically is because the mining industry is expanding so dramatically, and they now receive about $2 billion to make the diesel that operates their trucks that dig up our country and ship coal overseas to fuel climate change, makes their diesel cheaper. And when we were talking earlier about these fossil fuel subsidies being material to these companies' profitability and their ability to build new projects, last year around the federal budget there was some speculation that the federal government was going to take action and reduce this diesel fuel subsidy. And the Minerals Council and a number of mining companies came out in Queensland and said, if you make us pay the full amount for diesel, our mines will close. There is a very concrete example about how these subsidies are underpinning the fossil fuel industry's development. We're allowing the oil, gas and coal seam gas industries we're giving them a $1.5 billion subsidy every year through accelerated depreciation. We're allowing them to write off their investment in infrastructure, and sometimes not even infrastructure, in new projects at a much faster rate than other industries are allowed to, and to offset against future profits. $1.5 billion a year. And we're also subsidising the aviation industry with a nearly $1 billion a year subsidy. So Wayne, just these 4 fossil fuel subsidies $35 billion a year. And plenty of opportunities to get started if you don't have enough courage to take that all in one bite. Last year they received 300 submissions from the Australian public in the lead up to the federal budget on all sorts of issues. This year they received 1,500 submissions from Environment Victoria supporters calling for the government to remove all fossil fuel subsidies. So thank you so much for really playing an important role in this campaign. We also made a formal budget submission as an organisation. We've now sent that to all federal MPs, and we're pointing out to them that the federal government's spending more money on the fuel bills of mining companies than it does on government schools, and reminding them that these fossil fuel subsidies add up to the equivalent of $60 million funding from taxpayers of every single electorate around the country. We're working to establish a national coalition of NGOs on this issue and making real progress there. We're working towards some serious, we're looking at billboards and treasury receipts, billboards at Canberra Airport as the politicians get off their planes and head into Canberra. But we really need your help. So, to summarise, sign the letter to your MP, fill in the details and leave it with us before you leave. If you tick the box saying you're interested in more information on the campaign, we'll let you know about all of those electorate actions. We'll let you know when we're going to be having a National Day of Action in April, where we're at service stations around the country, highlighting to motorists that they're paying over 30 cents more per litre than Gina Reinhardt or Andrew Forrest or Extrada or Rio Tinto. We'll let you know about all the campaign activities. Please take some of the petition sheets on your way out if you'd like to do more. Then send them back to us when you've compiled the details and gotten your friends to sign up to the campaign. Thank you so much for being part of this launch and part of this campaign. It's been possible to launch this campaign because of the support that Environment Victoria has from its supporter base and donors, whether it's financial support, volunteers and activists. This is not really the sort of campaign that you get corporate sponsorship to run. It's also not the sort of campaign that you get government funding to run. We'll be continuing to get closing Hazelwood and other dirty power stations, keep it on the national agenda and get some action. We'll be defending the price on carbon for all its faults, but going after the bad parts of that package in the context of an attack on all forms of climate action in the lead up to the federal election. We'll be continuing our important work on rivers and water, and we'll be running our Reclaim Victoria's Environment campaign, which seeks to highlight and communicate all of the attacks that we've had on our environments under the Bailey government and ensure that we get the environment back on the agenda and lead up to the 2014 state election. So it's not all we're doing, but we're really excited to be able to move into this really important systemic space. So join with us and together let's extract billions of dollars from some of our most damaging and dangerous polluters and put it to some public good. Thank you.